Welcome and thank you very much for joining us for this eighth episode of YCP's virtual monthly series, Refiner's Fire. Every month, Catholic business leaders from diverse industries share professional and spiritual wisdom in short 30-minute live sessions. In spite of the short length of these segments, we truly hope these tips and insights will be really powerful for all of us as we strive to work in witness for Christ this year. The name of the micro interview series, Refiner's Fire, actually comes from Scripture, from Malachi chapter 3, verse 2, where we learn that God is, quote, like a refiner's fire, who seeks to purify us and make us the best that we can be. And that's the whole point of this series. Through the inspiration and wisdom of these exceptional Catholic leaders, we're challenged to improve in small ways in our professional and spiritual lives. So let's be open to this journey of refinement, so that in everything we do, we aim for a higher standard of excellence that gives glory to God. Our topic this month is the lost art of listening. What does it really mean? Human connection is so essential to our lives. We're made for communion, and all around us, people or ourselves, are starving for the opportunity to be heard, acknowledged, and understood. Listening is also a critical skill in the workplace and any environment where personal interaction is required. So basically everywhere. Listening with intention directly impacts your personal, spiritual, and professional lives. So back with us today from our recent conference, I'm thrilled to introduce Dina Dwyer-Owens, former CEO and co-chairwoman of Neighborly, to talk to us today about the lost art of listening. Thanks so much for joining us, Dina.
Thrilled to be with you.
Terrific. Well, let's get right to it then. As professionals and as Catholics, why should this topic matter to us? And why are you so passionate about this topic of listening?
Yeah, a recent devotional I read was, listen and you'll have life. And it's so true. Listening is a part of almost everything that we do each and every day. And I think when we genuinely listen to others, we do create that connection, and that connection leads to a level of trust that's so important in any relationship we have. So whether it's professional, spiritually, within our own personal families, I think listening is just critical. And it's an area that I need to be refining constantly.
Yeah, and especially I just think back over the last 18 months or so and how isolated we've been. And I can imagine that we're yearning to be listened to perhaps even more than usual. So this is such an important topic for us to talk about. So let's go a little bit more into this here. It's really a human tendency to talk about ourselves. So how can we develop these skills of listening and asking rather than speaking immediately at the beginning of conversations, to seek to listen before we seek to be heard?
Peter, I'm a big believer in having clarity of values. So at Neighborly, which was the company that had the privilege of leading for many years, we had a very clear code of values. And one of our values was about listening, because it's so important. And the value is listening with the intent to understand what is being said and acknowledging that what is said is important to the speaker. And like you said, it's not about what we need to say first. It's about what is the other person trying to communicate. So I've got a great acronym, but before I jump to that, I want to talk about an experience that was really, it just stayed with me. When we would conduct our board meetings, I remember at the beginning of the new year, we would typically say, which value do you need to get better at? So kind of a values New Year's resolution. So we go around the board table and each board member would have to honestly share what value they needed to work on. Mine very often was listening with the intent to understand what's being said and acknowledging that what is said is important to the speaker. As we went around the table this particular year, though, I bet the majority of the board members had the same value resolution. So it's a challenge for, I think, many of us. And I think that the more that we recognize that and we listen to live, people will have a greater trust and respect with us. And so kind of jumping ahead to an acronym that I think might be helpful for those viewing in today or listening is EARS. And many of you as professionals may have already heard this. Always think about the visual of God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I remember being at a seminar where the speaker came out with the big goofy ears, right? Just to kind of emphasize, we are supposed to be listening so much more then we're supposed to be talking as leaders and as professionals. And so the acronym that I like to follow is EARS. And again, think about the visual, but then think about, what does E mean? It means to empathize, and really put yourself in the shoes of the person and what it is they're trying to convey to you. So become part of that story. Kind of like when we read the Gospels, right? We're supposed to become part of that story, but do the same thing when you're listening to somebody else. And then A stands for asking questions. People believe you're a great conversationalist when not only you're listening, but you're asking questions. So you're digging deeper. So dig deeper, learn more. Next would be responding. So finally, number 3, you get to respond, right? It's not the first thing you do. It's the third thing you do. And then I would encourage you with the S to summarize. So I think it's very helpful when you really listen to somebody and you want them to know that you heard them, is to summarize an important point that you heard from them.
I think it's such a good point. And I just think of the asking point as well. I mean, how important it is just in life in general to be good at asking questions, right? Thinking about more open-ended questions versus yes or no questions, questions that can really engage people. And this goes far beyond just our personal life. It goes into better doing our work as professionals, better working on a team, being a better spouse, being a better brother or sister or sibling. So that asking questions piece is so important. And I love what you added there about summarizing, so that we can take the time to both digest what others are saying, but also show them that we heard them.
I have to just jump back to the whole thing about your spouses. So at the company, I was a very good listener, or I believed I was. We'd have to ask other people. I got rated pretty highly on that one most of the time. But at home, that wasn't always the case. So when you talk about your spouse, I mean, how many times have I been across the table from my husband and he's trying to share something with me, and the next day I'm like, now, when are we doing that? I told you 3 times yesterday. So it does need to work in all areas of our life, especially with our spouses and our children too. Today, more than ever, I think our kids need to know, and our grandkids need to know that we are listening. Your audience is too young to be talking about grandkids right now, but I'm there. But you're right. It needs to apply to every area of our lives. And when we are doing a good job of listening, it's amazing how much better all those relationships are.
Absolutely. Let's go on to our next question here. So the saints can be great models for us on how to be better listeners, how to listen to God by making time for silence, how to better listen to others. Why do you think listening is so important for human growth and development? And also, how does it help us to draw closer to God? And perhaps if you have any, maybe any practical examples yourself, and maybe how listening in your relationship with God, it looks a little bit more practically.
Because this is an area that I need a lot of work on, I actually commit to going on a silent retreat, spiritual retreat. I'm doing it almost every 6 to 8 weeks now, but one very big one a year at least, which is usually around the Advent season. And what I have found is that silence is required for us to be better listeners. And when you go away to a silent retreat, if you've never done it, I highly encourage you to sign up now, maybe for the upcoming Advent retreat in your community, or there's got to be something fairly close by. I have to go 45 minutes to Cedar Break in Texas to go to mine. But you put the phone away, and this could be for 40 hours. It could be for 5 days. It depends on how long you want to go or can go. But being quiet with God for just 40 hours is one of the greatest leadership lessons. You're forced to quiet. Everything gets quiet, and then you're more able to listen. And I always come home from those retreats. Again, we'd have to verify this with my husband, but a better listener, because I realize that listening is so important. All the noise we have going on around us, especially those of us who are professionals, there's just so much coming at us so quickly that quiet time in a silent retreat allows us to be better listeners, but really better in our faith walk. It's just incredible. One other quick example, and my aunt Loretta is not a saint, but I would tell you she's about as close to a saint as there could have been on earth that I knew. And what a listener. This is a visual I want people to think about, is anytime you spoke to Aunt Loretta, she would basically grab your hands in her hands and look you straight in the eye and listen to what you had to say. And then she would ask those clarifying questions. She would respond sometimes with her own stories, because her stories had a lot of wisdom, but she would always summarize at the end what she heard you say that was so important to you. So that visual to me helps. When I feel like I'm racing through a conversation with somebody, I think, okay, slow down, hold the hands like Aunt Loretta would, and really listen.
Absolutely, and that's such a great visual for us to keep in mind when we're talking to someone, especially when we find ourselves daydreaming or the brain kind of wanders off during a conversation and we realize that we're not really paying attention to what the person in front of us is saying. But I also think of those small moments, those moments that we can be silent, that we can maybe take even just 30 minutes at the end of a day and decide the 30 minutes before we go to bed is not going to include our phone, right? And whether or not we've built up the prayer life to fill that with prayer and conversation with God, at least starting with silence, at least starting with an empty space where God can interact with us, where we give him space to do so. Another tip came to me from one of our past speakers as you were just talking. He told us that when he's driving, coming home from work, he spends that time with the radio off, with his phone off, and he spends that time preparing to come back into his family's life, to come home. You know, he has a bunch of kids and a wife, and it's such a beautiful idea. So whether you're coming home to a family or coming home to roommates, or maybe even just coming home if you live by yourself, that moment or a few minutes of time to just adjust from a hectic day at work or whatever it else is that you're doing, and just adjust yourself into a little bit more of a listening rather than talking and sharing. Just kind of putting ourselves in that presence at the end of the day, I think is can be really helpful. I know that tip struck me pretty deeply when it was shared from a past speaker.
Great advice. And even praying to the Holy Spirit, just help me be a better listener. When you're about to go into a conversation that you know you might have more to say than you might get to say, is just saying, you know, Holy Spirit, just guide me. Give me the humility to be quiet and listen, and then speak the words that are necessary when it's time.
Yeah, exactly. Really good point. So just a reminder to our audience, we will be taking some questions from you soon. So you can just fill in those questions in the comments section of Facebook or YouTube, and we'll be glad to get to some of those with Dina here shortly. So Dina, moving on here, just a little bit more about our calling as Catholics, to really evangelize, to be willing to share our faith boldly. You know, here at YCP, we talk about that specifically in the context of our workplaces, but it applies to all aspects of our lives. So how can being a good listener at work help us to better understand others, and as a result, perhaps be better positioned to share the joy of our faith, to share something with people that may not have heard of our faith before?
Just the exercise of really listening to somebody alone, Peter, I think says a whole lot about who you are as a person and how much you really do care about others. Yeah, I love the definition of love is to will the greater good of another. And when you listen to somebody, you really listen to somebody, I think that it comes across to them that you do, there's a love there, that you really do care about them and what they have to say. And, you know, my experience in the business world, and I've had a chance to work with so many wonderful people, but the people that I have the greatest admiration for are the people who took time to listen to me, even if we didn't agree. At the end of the conversation, I remember a private equity partner. When I first got into the whole private equity scene, our company went from being publicly traded to private. And there was a co-founder of the company's Riverside. I'll just say the name of the private equity group. And we ran into some learning, right? You're going to run into learning anytime you're in a new relationship. And there were some things that were quite frustrating to me. But he always told me, if you ever have any issues, please come to me and I will listen, and then we'll work through it. And he did that every single occasion where I had a challenging moment. I could go to him, respectfully share what the challenge was. He would always listen. I always knew I was heard. He followed that principle of ears, always knew I was heard. And at the end of the conversation, we would come to some agreement. And truthfully, when there were challenges that I felt like I was right, but after he listened to me and then he gave me his perspective, I found that I didn't have all the answers. And many times he made me a much better leader because he added value to the conversation, but he did listen.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that because it helps us see that our perspective is just that, our perspective, right? And we always, or at least pretty often, I don't know, I seem to always think I'm right? But but it just doesn't work that way. And when we can listen, we can come to understand another's perspective. So what about other opportunities in the workplace where, you know, maybe we find moments where we can approach a coworker who's seems to be struggling with something, and use that opportunity to listen, use that opportunity to perhaps share something about our faith or something about our relationship with God. Any tips or tricks or maybe any experiences that you've had in your professional experience?
Yeah, I think that probably the greatest thing I can share is that I had the opportunity, of course, to speak in front of our franchisees and our associates on a frequent basis. And there was one particular course that I taught all the time. And we don't have to throw our faith in anybody's face. It's not necessary. And in fact, it turns people off. So I took the opportunity to always add what was important to me. And when I talked about my day, somebody might say, well, what does your day look like? You've got a lot to do. How do you get through the day? And I would talk about the first thing I do before I get out of bed is I pray. I count my blessings. There's so much to be grateful for, but I pray. Then I might go on to also share that I physically go to Mass. What a gift the Catholic Church gives us is that we, no matter where we are almost in the world, we can go to Mass and receive the Eucharist. Wow, who would pass that up? Unfortunately, a lot of us pass it up for sometimes the wrong reasons, and sometimes we just don't have the time to put in our schedule. But I think sharing with people what works for you, and again, in a way that is not judging them or shoving our faith down their throats, but instead just sharing, have you ever tried this? Maybe even giving them a devotional. I have found that to work with so many people. I might give them just a monthly missalette and just say, people may not realize this, but, at church, we actually cover the whole Bible over a 3-year period of time. So this is a great little daily thing. You get some Old Testament, some Psalm readings, and some New Testament. Would you be interested? I haven't had a single person turn me down.
That's amazing.
Read or not, I don't know. But it's giving them something sometimes that they can take home and spend time with is also helpful. I just keep a stack of certain, there's certain books I love that I think are easy to read that people can reflect on that have daily meditations. And then there's the daily missal.
Absolutely. It's good to have something that you can give someone physically to remind them when oftentimes our words may be forgotten, but if they're holding something when they get home or get in their car, maybe they can be reminded. So what about those situations we've all experienced where we don't feel the other person or party is listening, when we don't feel heard? That can be so challenging because our instinct is to pounce, right? It's to lean forward, and you start getting maybe a little more aggressive, and you're interjecting, and that can just lead to the breakdown in the conversation, or at the worst point, a relationship being lost with someone. Any tips that you'd share with our audience in terms of what do you do in that situation where maybe you feel someone isn't listening to you?
In the case of at Neighborly, we all had agreed to follow the code of values. And because listening was a big part of our code of values, that's a beautiful thing about having clarity of your values, especially in a work setting. Because if, Peter, you and I have a conversation, it's clear that you're not listening back and say, hey, Peter, can we review our value of listening with the intent to understand what is being said? Because I don't really feel like I'm being heard right now. And can we just take a deep breath and start over? And if you've got way too much on your mind right now, Peter, I get it. Can we schedule a time where you can really just devote 5 minutes to me? Because I really need you to hear what I have to say about this. So there could be other opportunities to get together when they do have the time, because it's a busy world. Sometimes we have way too much on our plates. And if you've caught somebody off guard, sometimes they really just can't listen good because they're thinking about that project that's due in 5 minutes that they've got to get done. So I'd go back to the foundation of having clarity of values amongst a team. That way, when it comes to holding somebody accountable to treating you as you'd like to be treated, we physically had a card we'd pull out and just say, pause, can we agree we're going to follow the values in this conversation? Because I'm really working hard to listen to you, but I don't feel like I'm being heard. And you do it again without being defensive. It's not always easy to do, but it's that accountability that everybody's agreed to. If you're not in a situation where you have those clearly written values, maybe encourage people to come together and create those.
I was just thinking, if you flip that, if you do the reverse of what you just said, if you imagine someone else is sitting in front of you and you start to gather an inkling that maybe they're not feeling heard, maybe you start to see some of the body language or the tone of voice, things like that. And I can imagine in that setting being able to say to someone, look, this seems like a really important topic to you. I really want to be able to listen to you, but right now I have a deadline in 5 minutes. I'm giving this massive presentation and I need to finish preparing or kind of get my mind in the right place. I really want to hear you. Can we reschedule for 2 hours from now? Let's have lunch. I really do want to hear you out here. So being aware of your own attentiveness and taking that opportunity when maybe someone else isn't hearing, feeling heard, to find a way to make sure that they can be heard, maybe in a different setting or a different time, I think can be important, especially from a manager or an owner or a leader perspective in a professional setting.
That's great advice. Yeah, if we would just slow ourselves down enough to recognize that somebody's fidgeting in their seat and I am not doing a good job of listening. And most of the time you can reschedule those. And one other little tip I'll throw out there, one thing that worked well for me, because I'm easily distracted, is I do something called a walkie-talkie. So if I knew somebody really needed my undivided attention for a while, and I always need my exercise, right? I can't get enough exercise because I never miss a meal. So I would encourage people, can we do a walkie-talkie? So, bring your tennis shoes to work, or, comfortable shoes, so that we can just go even around the parking lot. And when that happens, I am a much better listener, because other than maybe the ducks on the river quacking, I don't have a lot of distractions. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm really paying attention to listening to what they have to say. So that's just kind of out there, but that's something that really worked for me in the leadership role I had, is when somebody really needed to be heard. Many times I would just schedule a walkie-talkie. Let's get away from the office and from all the noise and the interruptions, and I'll do a better job of listening.
Yeah, that's a great tip, to be able to extract yourself from the most common distractions that we're going to have, especially in a workplace setting.